at 6 p.m., although we're going to be changing that. I'll announce that at the end. Tonight is going to be a little different from our regular format. For weeks, since Alameda County declared a shelter in place, we've been bringing you a weekly update on the pandemic, the health crisis that has been gripping our entire region. But we believe that this is a week to set that crisis aside, because we must talk about the other crisis, the crisis of structural racism, and particularly as it manifests itself in policing. And so tonight, I hope you will enjoy an engaging two-part series. This is the first night, and we will do this again next week, because it is time for us to address America's other pandemic of racism. We have gone through just an unprecedented level of grief, of rage, of a demand for justice over these last weeks. And it has been painful on just about every front. We have lost not just George Floyd and Breonna and Tony, and the list goes on. It is this cumulative loss of Black and brown lives at the hands of police, state-sponsored violence, that is outrageous, and it demands change. I personally have been reflecting over this week about a time in my life nearly 30 years ago, my last year in law school in Los Angeles, when the Rodney King verdict came out. And as someone who had put so much time and energy into studying the law, the system of justice, to see the verdict, to see that those police officers who had so mercilessly beat a Black man were let go with no consequence, felt like an affront to every moral belief I held. And it is nearly 30 years later, and so little has changed. And I want to acknowledge that during those 30 years, I have still been white. I don't experience this trauma in the same way that Black and brown and other people of color and other people of non-dominant identities experience the constant stress and oppression of racism, of discrimination. We also find ourselves at a moment where there is a growing schism around what safety means. A growing schism where many people feel that police are here to protect and serve. We know in Oakland, more than 100,000 people call 911 every year in their moment of trauma and fear. And that Oakland police have saved lives, prevented harm, have prevented criminal activity, have brought resolution and justice to victims. And we also know that for a growing number of people, particularly people of color, police do not invoke a sense of safety. They invoke a sense of oppression, of racism, of violence and abuse. Both these things are true. And we have a moment where we can continue to see this divide or choose a third story of a place that we can move to together, where people have such a sense of safety that government intervention, that armed response is no longer necessary. As we begin this journey to where I hope we will end up in that place of shared safety, we have to start with an understanding of where we are. And certainly in the last few days, much has been said and demanded about defunding the Oakland Police Department. And so if you will excuse me to go into my geeky budget nerd place to just set a little bit of the record straight about how Oakland does or does not fund its police department. The Oakland Police Department comprises 20% of our budget. 20%. I've heard all sorts of numbers over the last week. The accurate number is 20%. And I went back historically and saw that that number has not changed for a long time. It has been 19 or 20% for many, many years. The current proposed budget for the city cuts roughly $5 million out of the Oakland Police Department's budget. And it adds roughly $22 million to things like affordable housing, homelessness services, job training, addressing the illegal dumping in East and West Oakland, and of course, parks maintenance, thanks to the passage of Measure Q. And those investments are being made in a budget where overall we had to cut $122 million due to COVID-related revenue losses. I do not believe we need to defund in order to invest in these community priorities. That is what this budget does. And again, in this conversation about what matters, where should we be putting the public dollar, I also encourage everyone to not just look at the city of Oakland's budget. It is a significant, but not even the majority of the slice of all the public funding that creates the services that people rely on. Public education, health, mental health, social services, and support. Those are in other agencies' budgets, like the Oakland Unified School District and Alameda County. So those are just some things to be aware of as we engage in what I believe will be Oakland's journey to a shared sense of safety. I want to acknowledge that this moment is ripe for a transformative leap towards justice. I hope that I am not alone in not just feeling grief, but also feeling hope. How can we take full advantage of this moment where huge change seems possible? And I ask everyone who is listening to ask yourself, what is giving you hope in this moment? Is it your family and friends? Is it your faith? Well, I have to say, for me, it is Oakland. I've always loved this city. It is such a resilient city. It is such a creative city. Our community is so rich with love, with aspiration. And tonight you are going to hear from some of our community's most incredible leaders. You're going to hear from Darlene Flynn. Darlene gives me hope every day because she is doing the work within the city of Oakland to dismantle structural racism within our city functions. And she's not just doing it in the police department. She's doing it in how we choose which roads to pave. She's doing it to really shine a light on the insidious racist oppression of land use policies. You will, I hope, love hearing from Darlene. You're going to hear from Lieutenant Fred Chavies. And while tonight he's going to talk about his work from within the police department as the leader of the race equity group, like many other departments, the police department is now starting this internal work. But I just learned that he was the commanding officer who took a knee with the protesters in solidarity and has his entire line of officers go down on that knee in solidarity. Thank you, Lieutenant Chaves. You made us so proud in that moment. We're also going to hear from Guillermo Cespedes, Oakland's very first chief of violence prevention. How to lift up these non-law enforcement interventions to create safety is his life's work. And particularly, I've been so inspired by his most recent proposal that really sees the intersectionality of race and violence and health impacts, as he has thought about how his work can also complement our desire to combat the racial disparities of COVID-19. And then finally, someone who is well loved and well known in Oakland, and that is John Burris, a lawyer for social justice. Someone who has been fighting for police accountability and the end of racist and abusive practices in all police departments for years. And most recently, he has fought to create a more racially just environment within OPD by asking that we look at officer discipline within the department and lay bare the racial disparities there. He has said, and I agree with him, that you have to have your own house in order before you can make change everywhere else. That is what gives me hope. You, the community, the other leaders that are among us, this is a moment that we all have a part to play in walking towards that better future of reimagined safety, reimagined justice. And so tonight I will not be playing my normal role as moderator. That will be done by Darlene Flynn. This is a moment for shared power and other voices besides the voice of governmental authority. Also, we encourage everyone after this town hall is done to tune into the Police Commission meeting tonight. And that is why going forward, this town hall will only be held on the first and third Thursdays. I ask everyone to support and engage in the critical work that Oakland's Police Commission is doing. And that you can only do on the second and fourth Thursdays. And so with that, thank you. I look forward to this program tonight, and thank you for the privilege of introducing tonight's town hall.
Thank you, Mayor Schaaf. Good evening, everyone. I'm not really sure, even in this moment, how I'm going to begin, but I want to say that this is a moment of mixed feelings for me, and I get asked very often how I remain optimistic in doing this work and how I have stayed optimistic for quite some time, leading inside of cities for racial justice. But the last couple of weeks have been tough. So if they've been hard for me, who have all kinds of ways of staying centered and determined for justice, I can only begin to imagine how the rest of our city is feeling. So there is just to set the tone. I sometimes like to reach back to people who've come before me, and I was looking at the Kerner report, the Kerner Commission report, which was 50 years old last year, and I found a quote from Kenneth Clark. And Kenneth Clark is the doctor who's famous for doing the doll experiment that led to the Brown versus Board of Education tipping point of the civil rights movement. And he testified before that commission that was stood up by President Johnson after much unrest in Black communities across the country. And he said, "I read the report of the 1919 riots in Chicago, and it was as if I was reading the report of the investigating committee of the Harlem riot of 1935. the report of the McCone Commission on the Watts riot of 1965. He went on to say, I must again in candor say to you, it is a kind of Alice in Wonderland with the same moving pictures shown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction. So I just want to encourage all who are listening, and I can guarantee that those of us that are on the panel today are determined that this moment in history won't be followed with more inaction and a repetition of more reports that give the same recommendations that are never followed through on. But it's a pleasure for me to be here with these four men. Part of the joy of my work is that I get to work with lots of different people to advance racial equity in the city of Oakland. And I've worked with all three of these panelists. So I look forward to to hearing what they have to say. And I'm going to start by just showing a short PowerPoint. If someone can put that up for me. Thank you. I also wanted to make sure and draw attention to this first slide for the listeners at home. This is the information about how you can text in your questions and join the conversation. There are two methodologies here. Also, the support staff that is making all of this work, this magic work for us tonight, will be continuing to post these connections in the threads. So, next slide, please. I want to share with you just a little bit, or can I advance my own slides? Do I have control? No, okay. Thank you. There's just a few of these. They're drawn from trainings that I actually get to do with city staff. And another exciting thing about my job is that I get to talk about race and racism in a very forthright and direct way every day in my work with other people in the city who are joining with the Department of Race and Equity in an effort to advance racial equity for our city and for the people who live in it. So I have a couple of favorite slides that I open with. This is one of them, and this is a quote and that inspires me and that we all may have seen before. We can't expect the world to get better by itself. We have to create something we can leave the next generation. And that's from Gwen Ifill, the late Gwen Ifill. This is on all of us. This is a point of responsibility. It is not just the Department of Race and Equity or just the employees of the city of Oakland or the residents of the city of Oakland. This is a heavy lift that we are taking on when we talk about dismantling systemic racism. Oakland is different because we have a Department of Race and Equity. As far as I know, we're the only city in the country that has a full-fledged department. We also have 3 full-time staff dedicated, including myself, to moving this work forward. There are other cities that are in this change work with us across the nation, but we in Oakland have made a particular kind of commitment by codifying this through an ordinance and making it part of our city code and having a director that gets to sit in the cabinet with other city directors to problem solve and strategize about how we're going to get this done. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So when we talk about equity, we don't assume that we're all talking about the same thing. Sometimes people think we're talking about equality. And on the left-hand side there of this graphic, you see a depiction of everyone being treated equally. But what we're going for is equity, and equity is different. Equity is beyond treating people the same. Equity is making up for the history of this country that has situated certain groups of people to have different starting lines, to be standing on different levels from the very beginning, and to have different needs because of the treatment that has been received throughout the history of this country. So we have to define equity so people know we're all talking about the same thing, that we're talking about just and fair inclusion. We are talking about justice, and for all, including those from whom justice has been historically withheld. In an equitable society, in an equitable society, we have one where all have access to what they need to participate and prosper. in the advantages and resources of our society. The goal of equity work is to create conditions and systems that allow all to reach their full potential. And in equitable conditions, disparities are not predictable by race or gender or any other social identifier or marker. So in defining equity, we are also calling out what we have not yet achieved in this country, not just in the city of Oakland, but nationally, which is why the moment that we're having now is a national moment, because it is not unique. We share these struggles with the rest of the country. It is in the DNA of the United States. Next slide, please. Thank you. So it's important to know that that history of different treatment for different people has very, very real results in people's lives. And this is one of our most troubling and stunning disparity data points from our equity indicator report that was published in 2018. And I always include this quote from James Baldwin about having to look at these very, very difficult numbers. You can see here that African Americans are not just overrepresented in homelessness in Alameda County and the city of Oakland. We are astronomically overrepresented in homelessness. This is not an accident. This is a troubling disparity that we are working on right now. And part of the reason I'm using these particular slides tonight is because I am involved in a project with Alameda County to look at our homelessness services through an equity lens and to examine them for why it is that we have made so little progress for African Americans in the area of homelessness. And there will be a report out soon that should reflect some really good work that has gone on around this, that we can only hope and demand leads to changes that get better results in the future around homelessness. But I want to make another point about this disparity slide, where we see that African Americans are 1,797 homeless people per 100,000 African Americans in Oakland, as compared to the next closest, or to the most distant group, Asians, 43 people per 100,000, and white people, 268 people per 100,000. Disparity means comparing one group's life outcomes to another group's life outcome based on a social identifier, in this case, race. So the problem with this kind of data is that if we're not careful about minding the narrative that is likely to come into our heads or circle around it, we will miss the point of this outcome. And that is that it was created by circumstances that were beyond the people's controls that are being most impacted. Next slide, please. So when we start to talk about systemic and institutionalized racism, we're talking about those things that are beyond individuals' control. Patterns of social institutions such as government, schools, banks, courts of law, perpetuating negative treatment toward groups of people based on their race. Institutional racism leads to inequity in opportunity and inequity in life outcomes. And this, of course, includes the criminal justice system and policing, but not the criminal justice system and policing alone. Next slide. We can see how these systems of government and colluding energies in real estate and banking and insurance have inscribed these disparities in the geography of Oakland and every city in this country, actually, through redlining and other policies that were sanctioned and perpetuated by government and other authority institutions. And so we use redlining quite often to study what this structural and institutional and systemic racism looks like, because it is so palpable when we look at the impacts of it, how it has shaped the landscape of our city, the conditions that people are living in, and the opportunity that they have access to. It did not happen by accident, and it certainly did not happen by the choice of the people who were bordered into areas of low opportunity and are still being impacted by those conditions. Next slide, please. So in order to go against the grain, in order to go against the tide and the current of systemic racism, it is necessary for organizations or institutions like the City of Oakland to be very disciplined, because everything built into our systems is designed to perpetuate what we already have. So we know that we have to be very specific in our approach, that we want to be data-driven, that we want to know what our existing disparities are, like the ones we looked at around homelessness, that we want to make sure that the community expertise is involved in our thinking, because those who are most impacted by the disparities or who are closest to the struggle are most aware of the needs and what is needed to correct them. We have to uncover the root causes of those kinds of disparities and not be satisfied with explanations that blame those who are impacted, but go deeper to the root causes of those disparities. We want to amplify opportunity to close disparities in everything that the city does across departments, including in policing and law enforcement. And we want to address systemic burdens on communities that are still there. It turns out it's very expensive to be poor because of all the burdens that come in with poverty. And so we have to remove those burdens in order to give people a chance to thrive. And finally, as we come to our conclusions and start to work to impact disparities in our city, we have to ground truth our solutions with the community. We have not arrived until the community can tell that we've arrived, until they can tell that we've made a difference, and we have to keep checking in to know that. So we want to measure and report back to community how our work is going, and check in with them about what further improvements we might need to make, because it's not going to be a once and done. We're going to be unraveling a lot of challenges as we move forward to advance racial equity in the city of Oakland. I think that's the last slide, and that's just a little bit of background so you know how we're thinking about and talking about these problems in the city of Oakland, and that we are talking about them as being race-related and having a racialized component that we have to address if we want to get the answers right. So with that, I get to pass the baton. And next up to share his experiences with working on race and justice in the city of Oakland is John Burris. John is the counsel for the plaintiffs in our negotiated settlement with the DOJ. And he's been working on this since long before I got here. So John, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I recognize that we certainly are at a moment. The question is whether or not there's going to be momentum from this moment. This is really important. We've had moments in the past before my lifetime, but since, and you can look at the moment and some things happen. The question really is, are we at a time when momentum can be generated? And as I look at across the country, I'm inspired by the cross-section and diversity of people who seem to take up the issues of Mr. Floyd. What I wanted to say, that's a narrow issue. And I don't want to in any way undermine and belittle the point, because it's the death. But we have deaths all the time. I've been involved in 2 death cases since then. But the challenge that we're facing is more like what the mayor is talking about, and all of you are talking about, that the momentum that needs to be generated, are we taking care of the issues of communities that suffer, whether it's health, education, and employment? That's where the momentum has to be. There's going to be, and certainly there's real efforts around the country to deal with the police issues. There's no doubt. I think that the discussions that we have, that they're having nationally, has the potential to have state and local impact, whether it's the carotid hole or the knee in the back, or registration of officers from going different places, or racial profiling, which we've done a lot of work in Oakland. There are areas in policing that can be done. I will say that I'm not certain that the moment or the momentum in time will impact the question of the use of deadly force. And I know that's not something that many of you deal with, but it is a critical issue of when you shoot and don't shoot, and whether the new laws that have been set forth that somehow tweaks the issue of objective versus necessary, along with tactical work. These are important considerations that has to come from the top down, because, and I know that Fred could talk about, you got to get into officers' heads that there's a new paradigm here, and that paradigm can in fact save lives, and that will have to deal with the resistance that inherently has. But I think that it's extraordinarily important to consider the type of legal services that are being delivered, or police services, I'm sorry, that are being delivered, and whether or not any of those services can be delivered more effectively and more humanely outside of the police department. Having been involved in despicable cases where mentally impaired people have been killed and who should not have been killed, the question is whether or not that should be a situation where officers, trained police people who are down to have felony efforts should be involved in those types of cases. And certainly there's efforts being made in other departments to look at whether or not that's a police service that should take place. We also have the question all of you know, and that is the homeless question that is here. And should police be involved? Because the potential for abuse is so tremendously powerful, and it's right front and center. And then you just look at the protesting that we had and the police response to that. So whether or not those are areas that can be carved out of the policing budget, and more importantly, the work that is done, because the potential for abuse is there. Now, I will say, having been involved in Oakland for many, many years, I am pleased to know, and as a consequence of everyone's collective efforts, and Fred knows this and the mayor knows this, we don't have the beatings that we used to have. We just don't have them. And that is such a powerful thing to me, because every one of those beatings that I'm involved in hurts me deeply. Every one of these arrests that are false hurts me. And so to the extent that we have minimized that and the shootings and the beatings, a lot of great work is being done. And of course, we have to be mindful of not only how we treat the community at large, but the question is, how do we treat the persons on the inside? And a big issue that has been, for me, is I need to know and want to know the considered effort is being made to ensure that new officers, African Americans and people of color, when they come into that department, they have the same fair chance to get promoted or not, and to deal with any disciplinary issues as anyone else. And those are critical issues. I think that there is a desire to get this done. I am hopeful. And so to the extent that there's a commitment on the racial and equity and the mayor, Fred, other people in the department, I think that we are in a position to do a lot more. But I do think that the moment is here to consider whether or not there are police services that we have in the department that should not be done by police officers. And those are considerations that I think that we have to have real thought, from my perspective, in the future. If we want to make this moment, has momentum that brings about systemic change in going forward in terms of how the community and the police relate to each other. Those are my thoughts for now. And I'll be able to answer questions later.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, John mentioned Lieutenant Chavies, and I want to call him up to talk about his experience working on this issue in the police department. He and I have had a chance to work together. And so I think that I have seen some of the change that is coming forward from the police department through that work. And I'm excited about hearing more from Fred about it.
Good evening, Director Flynn, and thank you, Madam Mayor. I think having the opportunity to share on a panel with folks that have done such great race work in their lives, in Director Flynn and John Burris, I'm truly honored to be here. So I appreciate that. I just want to talk a little bit about my efforts as it relates to the advancing racial equity work within the Oakland Police Department. And so as obviously, if you can see me, you can see that I'm a Black man. I am also a citizen of Oakland. I grew up in Oakland. I'm a lifelong resident. I matriculated through OUSD and have young children right now that are students in the Oakland Unified School District. So understanding the things understanding like race in America over time, trying to work to change that, especially within my department and where I sit, is important to me. In the summer of 2018, I've been at the department since 2006, promoted to to lieutenant a few years ago, and in the summer of 2018, I was transferred from a patrol watch commander in East Oakland to the training division commander, in which I was in, and so I was in charge of running our entire training department. And at the time, Chief Ann Kirkpatrick, along with other members of the executive team, tasked me with taking a look at Dr. Eberhardt. If those are not familiar with, she she did some work on bias within the Oakland Police Department and came up with some strategies for change. And so I was tasked with either creating or finding some social tactics training for the Oakland Police Department. And so in a few years prior to my arrival in the training division, the department had rolled out bias training, both implicit and explicit bias, had rolled out multiple iterations of procedural justice. The procedural justice training was focused mainly on the way in which members of the police department treat community members that they come into contact with. The training was predicated on the notion that people care more about how they're treated than they do about the outcomes. And it focused on giving people a voice, treating people fair, being transparent, and working to build trust. And don't get me wrong, I agree with all of those tenets. They're extremely important, but I didn't think that they went far enough. If you talk about affecting real change, while those are good building blocks, the discussion and training needed to delve a little deeper into systemic and institutional failures and shortcomings as it relates to race, not only within the police department, but within America. And so in the fall of 2018, I had the opportunity to take an Advancing Racial Equity Academy class with Director Flynn and Jackie Ladenza at the city of Oakland. At citywide training put on for any employee within the department or within the city. And I had invited a number of folks from the department to take it. And in the multiple courses that I took, I was only able to get at least one other sworn to attend the class. And so I thought it was extremely important, and I asked Director Flynn, how is it that I could bring this class to the police department? Because obviously I can't get members to come to you. And so can we bring this training to the department? Because I think it's extremely important. And I also wanted to create a space where, we have these members at the police department that, I think that they're extremely tough, and they obviously were, some of them may have been afraid to talk in certain forums or to be open or to be honest. And so I wanted to create a safe or a brave space for them to really talk about race within the confines of our department, so that we can get more comfortable discussing some of these things so that we can truly make some change. Director Flynn gave me the autonomy to kind of steer some of the curriculum more toward a police focus because of the way policing in America has affected. We keep talking about people of color, but the way it has affected Black people in America. And so I wanted folks to have an open dialogue about race and equity, both internally and externally within the department. And so I was able to change some of the slides to focus on inequitable outcomes within the department, as well as even policing strategies within our community that have not achieved their intended outcomes, or did achieve its intended outcome. Like if you want to talk about the war on drugs, or even examining the prison industrial complex and the role that police have played and continue to play in that inequitable system, which some may say, oh, well, it didn't achieve its intended outcome, but some could argue that it did exactly what our society set out for it to do. And so trying to break some of that up. And so within the last year, we've held 4 of our Advancing Racial Equity Academies, which consist of 4 modules. As Director Flynn talked about, we've trained about 65 employees from the Oakland Police Department. The goal that I have is to provide training. I wanted to bring the course to the department mainly to educate our staff. And so, again, Director Flynn was gracious enough to take me on as a partner, and I appreciate that. She had to put up with answering my calls and texts and my emails late at night, because I had either been doing reading or listening to a podcast or watching a documentary that I felt that we should add to the curriculum, or I just wanted to talk to her about. I'm sure she's tired of receiving New York Times articles, but I think adding to our content helped to further build out our modules and also focus on the historical and even the current impacts of policing on our community. And I'm extremely grateful for that. The city of Oakland, just in general, is lucky to have her amongst its public servants. And so I am extremely happy that she joined the city in 2017. But I think the next step in our work is about mobilizing our equity team within the department. And so like many other equity teams within the city, we want to view things through an equity lens. And so that's looking at our policies, our strategies in which we police in our community, looking at those and ensure that everyone that no one is harmed by our policies. And so oftentimes, especially within the department, we may be blind to certain things. And so getting different sets of eyes and even engaging with the community when we talk about the ways in which we police. And I think Mr. Burris, he touched on this, and I think it's extremely important about the way in which police are used sometimes in the community may not be effective, and even the way in which a lot of times community members may weaponize the police department by using them. As you've seen, I know we talked a bunch about the murder of George Floyd, but in that same day or that same weekend, there was a woman who attempted to weaponize the police department almost it was reminiscent, at least to me, and I wasn't around, but what I've read about Emmett Till and the way in which folks can often weaponize other institutions in order to do harm to people of color. And so we want to take a look at the effects of our department, policing around the country and even around the world. A lot of these issues, they're centered around police, especially what we're talking about tonight and what we've seen in the last 9 to 14 days, but I would argue in the last 400 years. We have to look further than even police and get at some of the root causes, and you would find, I think, that they stem from like racism interwoven into our country's systems and institutions. So next week we're going to be meeting with our equity team to work on some topics like use of force, which is extremely relevant today. We're going to talk about, like Mr. Burris said, the internal discipline disparities, but even getting upstream on that and looking at, okay, we look at discipline outcomes, but how did we get here and who was given opportunities for training and even to promote and the like. And so we have to look at this holistically. I'm excited to continue to work pushing this message and encouraging everyone, especially those in leadership positions at least, to have these uncomfortable conversations to make change. It's not going to be easy, right? And I think even within the last year, I myself have gotten tired from time to time, being up late, trying to tweak things, which is in addition to my other job, right? But I know Brian Steverson, a gentleman who we often draw from either through documentaries or just his work in our class. He talks about it not being easy and that you're going to be tired. And so we have to do what it takes to get it done, and we have to be brave. We also have to continue to have these conversations, because I think another thing that's extremely important when you talk about race work is actually being able to have these discussions. And also, you can't heal unless you're able to talk about what truly happened. And I think that if we say, oh, we're making progress, and we don't look to the past, we're bound to make those same mistakes. And so we got to be ready to truly talk about racism and face racism head on. And so I appreciate being a part of this panel. I don't want to belabor too long. I want to get to Chief Cespedes and then maybe get to some questions and talk about next steps, so that this isn't just an empty conversation. And so, but thank you all for having me.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Mayor, for inviting me. Thank you to Darlene for the work that we've done together and the work that you've done by yourself, and to all of the folks in the front line of the communities in Oakland that have dedicated their entire lives to equity work. They didn't call it equity work. I worked in Oakland for 20 years. My oldest was born and raised here. Then I went to LA and became the deputy mayor of gang reduction there. And we had a very successful 7 years of learning a lot about what works. We also made a lot of mistakes. And we had a lot of challenges with the police department there. Then I went to Central America for 5 years. Because my old boss was convinced that the problems that were created in LA with street violence we unintentionally exported them. So he thought we had a moral mandate with Central America. I've said this to the mayor and to all of my colleagues, that at this point in my career, there isn't a bigger honor that I could have than to be back in Oakland contributing to the amazing work that's being done here. And I come at it from a position in this moment that I think we all have to look inward and figure out what we have all done to contribute to this problem. Not just the problem with law enforcement, the broader problem of the structural racism, the broader problem of the white supremacy that has permeated institutions in this country. I'm not law enforcement, but I do feel like I share part of the responsibility for coming up with solutions. And because I have been doing violence prevention work, and we interface with the criminal justice system, and which is a system that has been very oppressive. We know that. So of the work that I'm doing in Oakland, there's lots of things that I could talk about the Department of Violence Prevention, but I'd rather talk a little bit about mothers, because it's a group of mothers that call the Family Support Network, that every time I meet with them, I'm reminded how little I know after 42 years of practice about helping folks. We have a problem. Our family in Oakland has a lot of issues to fix. And we don't want to sweep them under the carpet. And at the same time, we also have to defend what's working. So my view is that we really do have to lift up the things that are working and lift them up and celebrate them. And we have to really call out the things that are not. So one of the things that I've learned from this group of mothers who have all lost children to homicide is how important it is for them to be able to grieve in a very legitimate way. And I'm going to explain to you why that's really important. Over the last 10 years, there's a report by the Berkeley Law Center that over the last 10 years, roughly 70% of homicide victims in Oakland have been African Americans. And of those victims, only about 40% have resulted in an arrest after a homicide. So imagine a mother that has lost her son or daughter, having to face the fact that they don't know what's happened with the case for years. They're referred to as cold cases. I don't like that term, because for these mothers, these are not cold cases. These are memories that are still very much alive. We've put together a system to help families that are victims of homicides. It's called Victims Assistance. It's not put together by the city, but it is part of the overall network of services that keep recycling certain problems, the trauma. Victims Assistance, homicide impacts everybody in the family, but not everybody in the family is eligible for victims assistance. It excludes people that are on probation, parole, have a felony conviction, or if they're not cooperating with the investigation. So while victims assistance is a good example of part of what needs to be dismantled, if you will, looking at violence through the lens of exclusively law enforcement or criminality. We've been, these mothers not only do not know what's happened to their children, but they also, by virtue of the fact that victims assistance is denied if it is perceived that the person had something to do with causing their own death. These mothers are left doing the kind of mourning that some people refer to as disenfranchised mourning. Not only have they lost their children, there is no justice, but they're in the community, they're stigmatized because it is perceived that they had something to do with the death. This is a minor example of the conversations that are happening in Oakland about restructuring components that keep Black and Latino families inside the criminal justice system. Darlene and I often talk about not just the industrial prison complex, but the social service industrial complex as well. And these are programs that are designed to keep people immobilized. Those go way back. We could start with the anti-poverty programs where a mother had to not have a man in the house to receive aid. We could go through all the programs that have, in essence, fragmented families by insisting that the problem was just a youth problem or a community problem. So my profession has been contributing to the problem. And having been back in Oakland since September, my team often refers to the level of pressure that we're under. Yes, we are under pressure, but that pressure is a privilege. That is the privilege that comes with being chosen to serve. I was brought up with the idea that this is an ancestral mandate, and that the rage that we're seeing across the country is ancestral rage because it goes back multiple generations. And it doesn't just impact Black and brown, it impacts everyone. I think it is really important for us to really come to terms with the fact that it's not just about changing a program or a protocol or a social service approach. It's about structural change. And we cannot really lose track of that. Right now, we're talking about the issue of law enforcement and the relationship of law enforcement with communities, which is a critical issue. We cannot lose track of the fact that this is a much deeper historical battle, if you will, in really redefining, is this country what it claims to be? Again, Oakland is exceptional. The fact that I'm referred to as the chief of police is a title that was created by the community members that created the department, that advocated for the department. I'm very proud of it. And I'm very proud of it because it signals just how different Oakland is. The mayor mentioned that he was the first chief of police, chief of prevention in Oakland. I think it's the first one in the country. I haven't seen another city that has taken that kind of step. So I like to kind of end this portion of the conversation with the following. We have a mandate, we have a moral mandate, we have an ancestral mandate to really be very clear that the words that we use and the actions that we take right now can build community or can destroy communities. That is a mandate, a level of pressure that is a privilege that I think we are all under, not just law enforcement. City officials, social workers, community members, we're all under the same mandate of making sure that we think through, are our words destroying or building? I think if we keep that in mind as we move through these structural changes of imagining a public safety approach that it's more humane, less driven by criminality and more by healing, more driven by protective factors rather than risk factors. In other words, more driven by what our communities have that works as opposed to what they don't have. I think we're going to come out of this with a better Oakland. And given that I've done a lot of work nationally and internationally, I know all eyes are on Oakland. And so, again, thank you for allowing me to be here, for being part of this amazing work that everyone is doing. And I welcome the questions or the dialogue. Back to you, Darlene.
Thank you, Chief Cespedes. Thank you. Thank you. I've been told by our back of stage assistants that we have lots of questions. I'm not sure how I'm going to see them, but I'm supposed to be able to see them pretty soon. I've not done this moderation process before. The mayor usually handles this. Oh, there they are. Look at that. Okay. So many questions. I'm looking for if there are any themes. This one is coming up a lot. Minneapolis has agreed to radically reassess the need for police in their city and move toward heavy defunding or of the department. Why would Oakland not seize this opportunity to again be a progressive leader nationally by following suit? Not sure who the best person to take that question is. Maybe Mayor?
Yeah, Darlene, I think that one is for me. I loved how Chief Cespedes said that we have an opportunity to focus on creation and not destruction. And I believe that Oakland is demonstrating its progressive values through its investments. And not to say that there is not a lot more work to do. But we, for example, we put in the budget last year, and in fact, I believe it's getting presented at the Police Commission tonight, funding to start to create a 24/7 crisis response unit that is staffed with people who are not with guns and badges, but are trained community responders that are bringing kind of care and crisis intervention. It's inspired by the Cahoots model out of Oregon. And we literally are getting ready right now, and Chief Cespedes is in charge of implementing this. There's been a year-long community process to really look at what our community needs, what are the existing response networks that are already embedded in our community, and how can we begin to stand up a system that actually connects to the 911 calls. And so that is the type of new reimagined safety that I believe people are demanding. And that is something that Oakland has already invested in and will continue to. I think everyone has to look at whether or not a department, whether safety is going to be advanced by defunding. Again, this is about adding, not subtracting. We have to invest in new training. We have to invest in more accountability systems. And those are things John Burris can talk to you extensively about, the computer systems and early warning systems that we've invested in, the different kinds of trainings. I know Fred alluded to them. Those require investments. Oakland currently has the lowest officer per crime staffing levels of any department in America. One could argue that we already have defunded our police department by maintaining such a low staffing level, and that has been in place for a very long time. So I believe Oakland is seizing this opportunity to be a progressive leader. I invite the continued dialogue about what that looks like, because there is certainly more work to be done. I do not think that defunding is creating change. It's only taking away something.
So it sounds like this proposal will eventually result in a structure where mental health calls won't be responded to because the death rate for people who are suffering mental health crises is very high in this country. So we will have a different strategy being put into place.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Absolutely, Darlene. I think that what we're moving towards is what the community member has said that makes sense, and there's lots of data to support it. That mental health problems should not be criminalized, and very often mental health behavior can be interpreted by law enforcement as non-compliance or something else, especially when you have serious psychiatric disorders, such as bipolar disorders.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is we really do need to start decriminalizing mental health, social services, victims assistance, shifting our paradigm of looking at social problems through the lens of criminality. That's what's led to the buildup of law enforcement over the years, that we insist in criminalizing things that are really social problems, and that includes youth violence. That's how we started the war on gangs. So this is a moment of really decriminalizing lots of functions in a city, so that we have more of a healing space rather than a punitive space. So yes, we're moving towards something else. It's just a very beginning step, and we have a long way to go. And I would like to add that it's not just the response to mental health issues. I think eventually we'll start talking about other types of responses that communicate to the marginalized communities that it's not okay for a body to hit the ground while we sleep. It's just not okay. That's not the values of this city. So eventually, that's where it's moving. A more community level response to problems that are community problems.
That goes, I think, to another question I see here, where it talks about the investment that we make in policing has not necessarily made everyone safer. That OPD continues to struggle and be an embarrassment to the city. And I think that some of that has to do with maybe this idea that the money that we're spending might not be matching the need quite perfectly and burdening law enforcement with other responsibilities. But that goes to the investment that we're making, that the mayor pointed out, that per crime, we are not over-policed or overstaffed. But are we getting the results that we want, I think, is the question that's being raised here. Are we getting what we want?
And Darlene, if I may, one of the things that we've been investing in is a more holistic and integrated vision of safety through our ceasefire approach. And one would argue that has made us safer. We've cut gun violence in Oakland by half over just the last few years, by half. We have gotten national recognition for our advancements in safety there. And both Chief Cespedes and Lieutenant Chavies can talk about how the police and the Department of Violence Prevention and our life coaches and our call-ins actually start from this premise that we want everyone to live and be free, but it is not okay to kill or harm people with guns. And that this integrated approach that has tremendous community leadership in it. And let me be very clear about the role of our faith community, and particularly Faith in Action, OCO, has really demanded that Oakland use that approach, and it has arguably made us safer.
Just to add a little bit to that, I think that I'm very aware of the work that Oakland has done over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And the mayor is very accurate. It's respected not just across the country, but in other places. I think the issue we have is that we've learned to put out fires. We now have to fireproof. And those are two different approaches. We have to make sure that folks that have their fingers on the trigger do not hurt community members. But we also have to make sure that people that are not even thinking of picking up a gun have the conditions so that their rage doesn't take them there. So we've done tremendous amount of work. Oakland has done tremendous amount of work. We have a lot more to do. And I think it's important to, both celebrate the steps that have been successful and keep thinking about what else do we need to do to make our communities heal differently. Not scar tissue, but actual healing, which is it's not like Western medicine that you could take a pill. It's a different kind of process. So, yes, I think we've done tremendous work. And I say we because I do feel a part of this city, even though I was away from it for about 15 years. But we have a lot of work to do. And in this area of healing, in the area of supporting victims, we work very closely with those men and women that get identified by ceasefire to provide them life coaching. It is not therapy, it's an approach that aiming at transformation. And from my point of view, that transformation has to include getting out of the revolving door of the criminal justice system, getting arrested, going into incarceration, coming back and being on probation, getting arrested again. That cycle we have to break. We just have to break. And so we're looking at ways of improving everything at this point, including the life coaching and the work of social workers and all of that. As I said before, we all have a mandate at this point to look inward and figure out how, what responsibility do we have in this historical moment.
And I would also say, so I worked as a member of the ceasefire team from its inception prior to my promotion, and I think that the ceasefire team takes an incredible approach, an approach that we hadn't taken, at least my career, through communicative approaches. So we actually, not only through the police department, but through the community, we reach out to those who are most likely to be impacted by violent crime, whether as a victim or a suspect or just violent crime adjacent, and trying to provide them with resources, because I think it kind of goes hand in hand, and I don't know that we've done a great job as of yet, but hopefully moving forward, it goes hand in hand with equity work. When you talk about getting upstream and not just locking people up in order to solve a problem, but getting upstream at what are the root causes. Is a person involved in this life based on a lack of education, a lack of opportunity, a life coach, like Chief Cespedes talked about, not even knowing where to begin. And so I think that it's important that the police, we can't, and people say this, and it's true, and I've heard it since I began, and I think we really need to take heed to it. We cannot arrest our way or lock our way up into safe communities. I'm working on a project with a number of folks from the ceasefire team, and also through the California Partnership for Safe Communities, where we're talking about collective healing and trying to be a part of a group called CBCR, Community-Based Crime Reduction, which is a network around the country. And there are very few of us that are sworn, but just having conversations about what can be done to reduce violence, not through police action, but through community-based strategies. And I think we have engaged in that type of work, and we're going to continue in that work. And I'll actually applaud Mayor Schaaf for taking that on and not utilizing the police department as a hammer in a way to reduce crime like we've done for years and years and years. But actually, okay, this isn't working. We've beefed it up. added this, we've created these teams. Like, how about we turn to our community to help? Because people, those that want us the most often get the least, the worst treatment from the police department.
Yeah.
And so, leveraging our partnerships within our community, and bringing all of the stakeholders to the table, whether it's through a call-in or through just a strategies meeting, in order to how do we reduce crime without saturating an area with the police and then having unintended outcomes, inconveniences to those that are in their neighborhoods trying to live. And we end up, and I'm honest about what the police has meant to our communities, we end up terrorizing a community even more right after they've tried to get some help from the police department. So I think we have to be mindful of that. And I agree with Chief Cespedes and also with the mayor about taking a community approach to trying to solve some of our violent crime issues.
Something else I'd like to lift up for a moment, which has to do with, there's about a network of about 3,000 people throughout the city that are doing this work, contracted by the city. There's a network of probably 3 or 4 times that of volunteers that are doing it without a contract, that are doing it because they love the city, that are responding around the clock to situations of violence in the community, that are very actively engaged. And I just think that it's important to recognize them as part of what or to uplift them as part of what the city is doing that we should be proud of. And that is the network of volunteers that I am amazed by them. I don't want to call them all out by name, but especially, in the area of sex trafficking, some of the work, the most advanced work I've seen in the country is being done by some of these folks in Oakland. So just want to make sure that we include that the Department of Violence Prevention of the city and the city of Oakland cannot do this by itself. The Department of Violence Prevention funds some programs, but the rest of the time we really work with community groups. And that's, in my opinion, that's the part that we have to fortify.
Yes.
That network of people that are already doing the work, they're just amazingly committed to the city. So just something else about what to lift up.
Yes. That's one of the things that makes Oakland, Oakland.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we're lucky to be doing this work in Oakland because of that. Thank you for bringing in sex trafficking and other forms of violence that are plaguing our communities as well. There's a question here about the response last Monday to peaceful students who were protesting who were tear gassed. And I know that, no one here was maybe on the scene there, but I guess it's important to speak to that if anyone can. We had a rough week. Mayor Schaaf?
Well, Darlene, I think it's appropriate for us to read the questions as the community stated them. And the question says, why did Libby allow OPD to tear gas our Oakland youth last Monday as they were peacefully protesting before the curfew?
Right.
And I think it's, don't edit the community's voice. You don't need to save my feelings. So I want to first say that it is horrific that any peaceful protesters experience the harm of tear gas, and certainly our own youth who are just so beautiful in their power and voice right now. There are 2 questions that it is absolutely the community's right to be asking all of us. And again, as the mayor, Libby, I represent that authority. One, was the city following its policies, which only allow tear gas in extremely limited circumstances where there is an imminent threat of harm? And so the first question, and we will be One, examining ourselves through an after action, which is like an in-depth investigation that should be done in about 30 to 60 days. But we also, today, a lawsuit was announced. So this question of whether or not this particular use was absolutely necessary under our policy, and that all the warnings and different protocols that are part of our policy were followed, that question will be answered. And if the answer is no, that officers offended our policy, they will be punished, they will be held accountable. And there is also a second question, and this is a question that I think we also will be having as a community. Is it appropriate to even have a policy that allows tear gas? That is a fair question. I do want to acknowledge that more than 30 officers were injured during the events that weekend. We know 2 federal law agents were shot at, 1 was killed. And so again, these protocols are supposed to be used when officers are significantly in danger of harm. And so that will be looked at. That balance will be looked at also in asking the question whether this policy is one that still serves us. And that is a conversation that we invite everyone to participate in.
Excellent. Strong and powerful answer. So with the $122 million deficit we are facing from COVID, why are we not looking to reduce the budget of OPD, which takes nearly 50% of the general fund?
So if Messiah could put that slide up again, we are reducing the police department's budget by about $5 million. I think it's just a little bit less than $5 million. And even though we are reducing the budget by $122 million, we have managed to add about $22 million for affordable housing, for homelessness services, for maintaining our parks better, for job training. For these things that we know we want to invest in human potential, not punishment. And I believe that the proposed budget does that. It does involve, in fact, the largest departmental cut in the budget is to OPD. We do have voter approved, voter mandated rules regarding no layoffs of officers. And those are things that also manage our budget decisions. But that is also a conversation that I know our city council will be taking up. But Messiah, did you put up those slides? Because there also was an earlier question about kind of police versus schools. Again, thank you. It's important that people know that you can't see what's getting invested in mental health or social services or public education by looking at the city's budget. Those investments are in other budgets. Now, there is a good question about whether or not the way that we divide the different functions of government makes sense, the funding allocations among us. I can tell you that aside from getting rid of the racist in the White House, my number 2 priority in this election coming up is to pass the Schools and Communities First initiative that would close a loophole that allows corporations to not pay their fair share of property taxes so that we can restore proper funding to public education. So that is another advocacy that I hope everyone gets involved in.
Very good. Public housing is up. To fund OPD for building public housing for people of all incomes that is easy to enroll in. Spoke to that a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like that, and that's again another example of the public housing budget is actually not in the city's budget. It is a separate agency, but you will see that we have been increasing our investment to create permanently affordable housing in Oakland. Again, in this proposed budget, we're actually adding $12 million. Again, cutting $5 million out of OPD, adding $12 million to affordable housing development. while we're cutting $122 million overall.
So we have a couple more questions here about defunding OPD. Community care, invest in community care, keep us safe. It is essential to defund OPD to take steps toward abolishing the police and invest in community-centered care, protect Black lives. And then again, asking the mayor to discuss the people's call for defunding OPD and reallocating that money to more direct community services. It's what we want. I think, do you feel like you've covered that question?
Well, I think it's good. I mean, that's not a question, that's a statement, and we should read those statements. We should capture community voice. There is a very, very loud community voice right now calling for the defunding of the Oakland Police Department. We also hear a very loud community voice, which resonates with me a little bit more, about investing in people, in housing security, in public education, in mental health, in public health. And that is absolutely shared value. And how we realign our resources to see the kinds of transformative changes, the advances in wellness. And Darlene, you showed one slide from the Racial Disparities Index just for homelessness, but we are tracking numerous measures of wellness where tremendous disparities exist. So I liked your James Baldwin quote. We are creating tangible roadmaps and measurable goals for ourselves to reduce those disparities, not just in police violence, not just in punishment, but also in those restorative and human potential advancements that we all care about. There are a couple questions that Lieutenant Chavies might want to weigh in on. One about police responding to people in mental health crisis, and also about why friends don't feel comfortable calling the police.
Well, so I think that I think it's important to reevaluate who's responding to those calls, and if police officers are truly equipped to be able to handle that. And I know that we put all of our officers through crisis intervention training, or CIT training, but I know that there are some whose life work is dealing with those who are those in our community that are mentally ill, and so or who are suffering from some mental break. And I think that if we had a more robust team, because we have a team that's through the Alameda County Department of Mental Health, a more robust team that was equipped to deal with to deal with that segment of our society, I can't see in any way how that would hurt. I think that oftentimes police respond to situations through this safety lens, whether the community believes in that or not. We respond through this safety lens, and oftentimes even just the mere presence of the police can escalate a situation based on the harm that our uniform represents. And so I think it would be extremely helpful to have others who are more equipped to deal with someone suffering from a mental health crisis to respond. I think that couldn't help. I even think, even when we talk about not even mental health, but dealing with responding to issues of adolescence, like, I don't know that the police are necessarily those who we should be sending to those calls. I think we need to provide the department or members of the department with more training on responding to adolescent crisis, but then also maybe if there was a team that are, again, better equipped to deal with those things, and also like educating our actual educators on when to call the police, and not, again, utilizing the police as a weapon, and working through conflict resolution without involving the police. And I also think that we as not just a police department, but as policing in America needs to focus more on conflict resolution as well. Especially if we're going to be in those roles, we need to spend more time training our officers on how to deal with conflict resolution. I know that we are implementing new training at the police department that will focus solely on de-escalation, and oftentimes we use all of these use of force tools, and we are now focusing on, okay, let's get away from that and let's focus on let's implement full-blown de-escalation training, which I think is much needed. And again, I've actually had an opportunity to work with the Oakland Police Youth Leadership Council, so OPDYLC, with Ms. Brooklyn Lee, Ade Powell, and a number of incredible youth. I'm appreciative that I've had an opportunity to work with that group, and they have a ton of ideas about policing and the youth. And I think when we talk about engagement through our Advancing Racial Equity modules, we have to engage the youth. And I think we've done a terrible job, not only as the police department, but oftentimes as city government, in telling our youth what's best for them and not bringing them to the table to make some of these decisions as it relates to their well-being. And so when you talk about mental health, you talk about other things, I would absolutely welcome additional help from the community or folks that that specialize in some of those fields to provide a different way to keep our community safe. And not even just to keep us safe, but to actually help, because a lot of time mental health issues are not safety issues, they're health issues. It's someone who needs help, and we may not always be equipped to provide that help. I don't know that there are any doctors that work at the police department. I know we have a few PhDs, but I don't know that we have any actual doctors that work here. And so there needs to be some thought put into how we respond to those calls.
Okay.
Or respond to those.
Mr. Burris, are you still with us? I just wanted to follow up on a question with him. Thank you, Fred. We might have lost him.
He's here.
He's here? Oh, good. There's a question here. You should be able to see that it talks about reimagined safety and justice do not include our corrupt police department, which is shielded by their union from repercussions. If you cannot dismantle the protections from the cops being held responsible for brutality and misconduct, then this will be more of the same. This seems like an area that I know, as an attorney, John, you have had some cases and you do work in this area. Do you have some thoughts on this question?
Well, I think that the issue of police unions and associations in all police agencies are challenging issues, because the union itself is just that. It is about getting as much as they can for their officers, and that frequently means that when they get something, they don't want to give it back. And that's tough. And so as we start to work through some of these issues around redefining the role of the police, well, there could be pushback on those issues as well. Now, for us, that we recognize one of the major issues that is talked about often, and that is that the officers have no skin in the game. That is to say, they can engage in acts of brutality, they can engage in acts of illegal misconduct, but it doesn't hurt them in any way, because number one, they don't have to pay. And when they don't have to pay, they don't lose anything. And frequently, in some cases, they may even be promoted or they get some other kind of job. So the feeling really is amongst, unless there is some pain, that officers will not in any way be willing to move from the position that they have. The unions will, in fact, protect them. And so what you have is bad officers having a very difficult time trying to move them out. Now, I do know in the last 10 years or so, certainly since one or more of the cases, the city attorney's office in Oakland has done a better job of trying to remove bad officers. But at the same time, it's a challenge because the due process rights that officers have, the union rights that they have, the state rights that they have under state laws, as well as arbitration rights, make it very, very difficult. So from my point of view, until you get a handle on making officers understand that there's a price to pay, really pay, then it's going to be difficult to get them to move. And the more they have, the more they want. And I hate to say that in a negative way, but it's so true. So you gotta, that becomes a MOU type problem, a memorandum of understanding and negotiation that you gotta have with them in order to tackle some of the issues that you want, that is the city want, versus what the union wants to keep, if you will.
Thank you. So we're out of time. I've gotten a message from our support that we can go on a little bit longer if the panelists are willing. Could we take a few more questions, maybe 3 more? Are you willing?
Yes, of course.
Okay, let's keep going just a little while longer. There's a question here I'd like to take. We must defund OPD. No more money should be spent on fruitless training that doesn't work. I'm sure there are some other thoughts on that on the panel as well, but as a person who does a lot of training, I am very, very clear that training is not enough. Training is necessary as part of a preparation for changed behavior or for implementing new procedures or alternative procedures to the business as usual tactics that may have been employed long term in policing or otherwise in the city. But in addition to that, we have to make commitments to codify changes in policy and then hold people accountable to that behavior change. It's not fair to ask people to change their behavior if they haven't been trained or haven't been given additional tools to substitute for the old ways. On the other hand, the follow through on that is definitely different forms of making sure that those newly trained behaviors are actually happening day to day in our work. And that is why everyone throughout the chain, up and down and across, needs to be paying attention to what our impacts are in communities that have been historically underserved. It takes more than just training, no doubt. Any other thoughts?
I'm going to say that these issues of training, sometimes it's the wrong training. Mm-hmm. It's just the wrong training to deal with certain kinds of issues, and this goes to areas that we suggest that maybe not be part of the initial response for police officers. When mentally impaired people or homeless people or protesters in certain areas, maybe the training they receive is too heavy-handed, and it's only one way. And so I'm not certain that the training they get in the academy for that period of time is too much in one way and not enough in another way. I mean, that's something that Fred and others are talking about, but from what I see, that given that the department doesn't change and you still have these areas that you got to cover that are strict policing, well, training that they receive may not be adequate on a consistent basis to cover those issues. So I'd have real concerns about it. I do have concerns about it. I do.
Lieutenant Chavis, is there anything you'd add? I mean, you do look at training a lot. I know you're looking at the training.
Absolutely. And in my current role, while I'm looking at training, and even when we talk about the defunding of the police department and some of the cuts to the budget and how we've cut some training, I think I'm extremely grateful to be in this seat to be able to look at what training is useful and what is not. And I think I come to this work looking at it through a different lens and understanding that which will make my community safer versus which would make me more tactical. And I think that we've done a lot in trying to focus on training, but I also think that training can't be a one-off. I also think that training can't be something that you get in the academy or something that you take to check a box. I think that that this kind of work, especially, needs to be interwoven into not only the training, but into the culture of the police department. Otherwise, it's just a class that you sat through versus something that you're actually implementing and putting into practice in your day-to-day duties. And so I'm reading through a lot, and again, like to the mayor's point, a lot of these are statements, and I appreciate the community speaking up, especially as a person from the community. I often tell, especially my academies now, and anytime I get an opportunity to provide any training, I want to train an officer that can. I don't need to train someone that can walk down my street and shoot, but that can respond to my mother or one of my other friends or loved one that's in need, and provide them with some assistance, some kind of help, and that can treat them fair, right? Because not everyone is treated the same way. I think some of the Stanford stuff has showed that, and I think that is the type of training that we're trying to get. We're also trying to break that the old way of doing policing, and I think Chief Ramsey retired Chief Ramsey from Philadelphia talks. He has an amazing TED talk where he talks about the history of policing and what policing has meant and what it has done and how it has evolved or has not evolved. And even NPR did a great piece over the weekend on American policing, talking about there is some training that we do that hasn't changed from the 70s, which is just not okay. And so talking about how policing has evolved from slave catching to Reconstruction policing to Jim Crow policing, the Civil Rights era policing, all the way up. And so we think about, there are some folks who I think someone on maybe the mayor talked about the things that have occurred over the last 30 years. But I would argue that it's been 400 years and a lot of things have not changed. And so we have to continue to try to train folks. And if we cease to try, nothing will get better. And so I think we have to continue keeping our eye on the goal and working toward progress. And again, I'm hopeful, like Chief Cespedes and others, that this momentum will continue. But to say let's give up and let's don't do it anymore would be quitting in a sense, and I disagree with that.
Darlene, there is a community question that I think is really important, maybe as a way of closing out at least my part, which is the demand for use of local models led by impacted community members. Oakland residents, specifically those in East and West who are most impacted, need to be at the center and the front and in control. Absolutely accurate that I've been in the field of violence prevention and for a very long time, and I understand completely that it's not possible to take one model from one area and bring it somewhere else and implement it. So for the community members that are in advisory groups to the Department of Violence Prevention, yes, you're correct. All of the models need to have the voices and the input and the knowledge of the communities most impacted by violence. And somebody else mentioned to me that I misspoke and called myself the chief of police. I am not the chief of police. I'm the chief of violence prevention, which is a very different matter. So anyway, just to those community members, fully in agreement, we do need to incorporate the voices, the conceptual frameworks, the ideas, all of that from East and West and Central Oaklanders who really are living daily and most impacted by the violence.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory, and I want to appreciate everyone for being here so long. There is a survey that you can fill out to give us feedback about this town hall. I want to especially thank the panel members who stayed extra long to take a few extra questions and talk about some more aspects of the work that we're trying to do in the city. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for moderating, Darlene.
No problem.
And if we are still on,
I believe we are.
good. Then if I could just give a closing remark also. I hear and honor the voices that are calling for police abolition. When we witness our state representative with a gun and a badge, like a psychopath, slowly choking the life out of a man, while we witness his 3 colleagues doing nothing and watching it happen, there is a very clear conclusion that whatever institution allowed that to happen should go away. I want to honor that and hear that and recognize that. I also want to recognize the absolute need, like John Burris said, to take advantage of this moment, to make a transformative leap towards justice. And that is about investing in human potential, access, opportunity, and that requires the dismantling of structural and institutionalized racism. And I hope that as a city, Oakland can set an example and together as a community choose to move towards a reimagined sense of safety that we can do together. So thank you. We will continue this conversation next week, same time, same